Hi, and welcome. Today's story takes place in Hollywood, where anything is possible. You can be a rock star producer and a millionaire by age 21 and turn around to find yourself behind bars for murder the next day. Rock and roll, money, booze, and egos with at the end of the road, a murder. That's the story of Harvey Phillips Spector, known as Phil Spector, one of the most successful and influential record producers and songwriters of the 60s and 70s. You might have heard of the Beatles, the Ramones, maybe the Ronettes. If the name doesn't ring a bell, then surely their #1 hit song, Be My Baby, should. Phil's first trial was comparable to O.J. Simpson's or Michael Jackson's, to tell you how big this was. But let's start with a little background. Phil was born in the Bronx on December 26 of 1939. His parents were Benjamin and Bertha Spector, a first-generation immigrant Russian family. Their own last names were so similar, Spector and Spectus, that both their families anglicized them to Spector on their naturalization papers. The similarities in name and background of the grandfathers led Spector to believe that his parents were first cousins. But were they really? Who knows? Sadly, his father committed suicide when Phil was only 9 years old. After that, he moved to LA with his mother. He went to a local high school where he mostly kept to himself. He didn't have a lot of friends. He spent the majority of his time in his room playing the guitar that his mother had gotten him. He was rather good, and eventually, he and a couple of friends formed a band, the Teddy Bears. Their first song, titled To Know Him Is to Love Him, in honor of his father, whose tombstone bore the epitaph, To Know Him Was to Love Him, was a huge success and won him his first $20,000, which was even more money at the time. The band was unable to replicate the success of this song, but it marked the beginning of Phil's career in the music industry. 2 years later, in 1960, he co-funded Phil's Records at the age of 21, which made him the youngest ever US label owner at the time. He developed what he called the Wall of Sound, a production style which he described as a Wagnerian approach to rock and roll, which turned out to be a huge success. Every artist at the time wanted to work with him, and he produced acts like the Ronettes, as I mentioned earlier, Ike and Tina Turner, the Beatles, several solo records by John Lennon and George Harrison, the Ramones, and Leonard Cohen, to name a few. By the mid-70s, Spector had produced 18 US top 10 singles for various artists. Aside from his career, he lived a lifestyle of seclusion, drug use, and increasingly erratic behavior. His conception of family life was also very particular, to say the least. His first marriage lasted 3 years and ended with him having an affair with Ronnie Bennett, lead singer of the Ronettes, which Spector managed and produced. They fell in love and married in 1968 and adopted a son, Dante Philip Spector. But after about a year, things weren't going so well between him and Ronnie, and for a good reason. Phil was extremely possessive and jealous. He also had abandonment issues, and the drugs and alcohol probably didn't help in that regard, but suffice to say that he kept Ronnie a prisoner in her own house. She was not allowed to perform anymore, so her career was at a halt. She couldn't go out where or when she wanted to. When she absolutely had to go out, he would force her to be accompanied by this life-size doll made to look like him for whatever reason. She was miserable and eventually turned to alcohol. That made her happy in a sense because she now had the opportunity to go out and attend AA meetings. She had no access to her shoes otherwise because he was so afraid she'd leave. And he would threaten to kill her and display her body in this coffin that he had bought and was keeping in his basement if she ever tried to leave. In the hopes of making things better between them and making her want to stay, he thought it would be a good idea to adopt a child and present the child as a Christmas gift for her. The fact that he was born on the 26th of December might have something to do with that idea, but I don't know, I'm just speculating here. It was sort of a last-minute idea of his, so according to Louis, his adopted son, there weren't many children left for adoption at that time. And since he wanted them for Christmas, he had to settle for quote-unquote what was left. And so that's how Louis and his twin brother Gary found themselves under the Christmas tree. But that didn't work, and in 1972, Ronnie would escape from the mansion barefoot with the help of her mother. In their 1974 divorce settlement, she forfeited all future record earnings and surrendered custody of their children. She alleged that this was because Spector threatened to hire hitmen to kill her, which honestly wouldn't surprise me at this point. He held a grudge until 1994 and shortly after, because in 1994, Spector wrote a letter to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nomination committee to oppose the Ronettes being considered for induction. He argued that the group was not a proper recording act and did not contribute enough to music to merit an induction. He was already getting all of their royalties, that greedy old man. Meanwhile, Estelle Bennett, Ronnie's sister and one of the two other members of the Ronettes, had really struggled with the sudden stop of their career and even found herself homeless a few times. The Ronettes were eventually inducted into the hall, but not until 2007, when Phil was kind of focused on other, more pressing things for him, like his trial. But for now, let's get back to 1974 for a bit. Phil, who couldn't stand the idea of people leaving him, drank more and more. Maybe there's a link there, but the same year, in 1974, he had a bad car accident where he almost died. He was thrown out of the windshield of his car during a crash and had severe wounds to his head. Ever since the accident, he became even more of a recluse, and when he would go out, he would wear wigs. What about the children, you may ask? Well, Louis, Gary, and Dante all talked about the kind of upbringing they had, and I have to say that it really hurt to hear their story. Already, they were children that were up for adoption, so they had a rough start, and they had to land in Phil's twisted, sick little fortress where they were only allowed to access their rooms, the kitchen, and the place where they kept the food on their way to and back from school, on which they were, of course, accompanied. Their dad's bodyguard, an ex-cop who worked for Phil for over 20 years, was the one who raised them, more or less. He was the one who showed them some affection, who cared for them when their father wouldn't acknowledge their presence. They could go up to weeks without seeing Phil, even though he was always in the house. Whoever visited wouldn't even know the kids were there because they were locked up. They were treated almost like objects that he would take out when he felt like playing with them, but the rest of the time they were literally locked in their rooms separately. Their routine was meals, school, room until the next morning where they did it again. The very sparse times where Phil would hang out with them, they had to be on their best behavior, or he would either send them away back to their rooms, I imagine, or sometimes even threaten them with his freaking guns. Last but not least, there was the sexual abuse that he orchestrated with the help of either call girls or prostitutes when his sons were still only about 9 years old. Sickening. To leave that subject on a better note, even though it doesn't make up for anything, it still doesn't hurt that they will now share the $50 million fortune that Phil has left behind when he passed away. If his last wife didn't spend it all before he filed for divorce while he was in jail because she was only allowing him $300 per month while she was spending hundreds of thousands of his money on jets, cars, houses for her mother, amongst other things like expensive jewelry. That one would like people to believe that she wasn't a gold digger. She said she worked hard and supported him. By the way, she only got hitched with him a month before he was sentenced, so let's just say she had fun while she could and got a little bit greedy and got cut off. Good on him. Leave it to his children to spend it. Anywho, I got ahead of myself because we were on his family life, and before the gold digger, there was another woman, his girlfriend, Janice Zavala, who gave him 2 biological children, twins, a boy and a girl. Unfortunately, the boy passed away at around 10 years old of leukemia, and Phil never fully recovered. His passion for guns would escalate, and he would take at least one of his guns almost everywhere he went, in the recording studios, even inside his home. It was public knowledge by then that he had a really bad temper, especially when he was drinking, and that when something would upset him, he could and would pull out his gun and threaten whoever he was with it. He did it to Leonard Cohen, he did it to the Ramones, he did it to John Lennon, and in that instance, he even fired at the ceiling. Heck, he even pointed it at a woman he'd never met who'd made a comment about his hair. He was so insecure and angry, but the people who knew him said that he also had a kind side to him, so Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I guess. Oh, and I remember now. In court in 2005, he said he'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. But still, And I know he had that accident and all, but can we take a moment and look at the wig situation? It was the wigs for me, by the way. I saw a photo on Google and was drawn in. I thought, what is this? And then I had to make this video. Anyway, it's time to get into the meat and potatoes of this story because that's why you're here. But now you know what kind of man he was, even towards his family. On February 3rd of 2003, a single gunshot breaks the early morning silence at the Pyrenees Castle in Alhambra, California. An emergency phone call is made to the police on which Spector's driver, Adriano de Souza, can be heard saying, "I'm Phil Spector's driver. I think my boss killed somebody." De Souza added that he saw Spector come out the back door with a gun in hand and that he said to him, "I think I killed somebody." He then saw the body of Lana Clarkson in the foyer and exited the property in fear that Spector would shoot him too. That's when he called the police while Spector was inside trying to clean up his mess, I guess. It took the police about 45 minutes to get there, and upon their arrival, they were greeted by Spector, who more or less said to them, "I think you need to see this. You're not gonna believe it," as though he had called them himself and was about to reveal how he was the victim of a burglary or something like that. The police asked him to raise his hands, which he did, but then he put them back in his pockets and they tasered him. They said they were fearful that he may pull out a gun. Anyways, after having been tasered 3 times according to him, Spector was taken to the police station cussing and swearing at Clarkson, who according to him had had the audacity to take her own life in his home when he barely knew her. Earlier that night, Spector, who was on a date, mind you, made a stop at the House of Blues, a popular concert restaurant location in LA, where he and his date were stopped by Lana, who had recently become a hostess there and who didn't recognize Spector. She told them that it was a private party and that they were not on the list. Her colleague had to intervene and let her know who he was so she would let him pass. Throughout the evening, Lana brought attention to herself. Maybe she was thinking it was her opportunity to either find a potential partner, a rich one at that. Maybe she only thought he could somehow help her with her career. But nevertheless, she was noticed. And since Phil's date wasn't drinking that night, he kind of let her go and waited for Lana to have a couple of drinks with her. As she wasn't allowed to drink with the clients on the spot, he waited, and after her shift, he insisted that she go with him to his place. She hesitated because she was working the next day, but she ended up agreeing, even though she specified that it was just for a glass or two and not for long. They got in his limo and drove to the mansion. The driver then waited in the driveway. Maybe because she said she wouldn't be long, I don't know, but he was there and he ended up being the only witness. Lana's body was slouched on a Louis XVI type armchair in the foyer with a single gunshot wound to the head. She had her vest on, her leopard-printed handbag was falling off of her shoulder, and she had her shoes on. Her legs were extended forward in a very odd way, as though they had been placed like that, and the gun was on the ground beneath her left ankle. Keep in mind that she was 1.8 meters or 5 feet 10, so there's no way the gun would have dropped from her hand down to her ankle in her position with those legs. But that's not the only thing that was off. The gun had been wiped and only her fingerprints remained all over it. A bloody rag was totally standing out as it was the only thing on the red carpet in the middle of the restroom next to the foyer. Lana had blood coming out of her nose, her right ear, and around her mouth, and it looks like she had a black eye, as confirmed by the notes of the prosecution's witness, Dr. Luis Peña, who performed the autopsy for the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. He also talked about an injury to her inner lower lip and injuries on her tongue, which could only have been induced by the forcing of the gun into her mouth, according to him. She had her 2 upper front teeth shattered by the shot, so all that was left were inner parts of what looked like some kind of base for dental work, like maybe veneers. Not sure, but that's besides the point. As I mentioned before, Spector's version of the facts from the start was that it was a suicide on her part. He told Esquire in July 2003 that her death was an accidental suicide and that she kissed the gun. He later filmed himself saying that he didn't know how or why or in what circumstances she would have done it, but that it was her doing. So another version of the facts. Was it an accident or intentional? Did she accidentally fire the gun while kissing it, or did she fire it with intent? At some point, he even said he'd left and she'd done what she'd done, as though he wasn't there, and in reality, the micro blood stains on his vest indicate that he was within 1 or 2 meters from her when it happened. So which is it? Make up your mind, Phil. It also seems kind of impractical for someone with the intent to end things to do it with a handbag over the shoulder, even more so if she was playing with the gun, kissing it, or whatnot. The main idea that the defense tried to highlight was that she was not in a good headspace and that she wanted to end it. So they brought up one of her best friends, also referred to as Pumpkin Pie, to the bar, who testified that Lana had confided in her that she was depressed and hated the people in LA, that she had had enough and wanted to end it, basically. They also brought up a producer that she had met once that corroborated that version. They brought up emails she had sent to people where she mentioned what a hard year it had been for her, even though they didn't highlight the fact that in those same emails, she was also saying positive things about the things she had lined up for the future. They hired an investigator to dig up more things on her, and she said that Lana was making ends meet by working for Jodi Gibson, the infamous Madam of Hollywood, as one of her call girls. She added that she was a regular of hers and that her specialty, if you can call it that, was playing with guns while providing special services. Jodi Gibson was not allowed to testify at the trial, however, for whatever reason. They portrayed Lana as sort of a failed washed-up actress who hadn't managed to make her dreams come true in Hollywood and was now looking for a rich man to support her and give her the lifestyle that she desired. While some of that may have been true, not only did she have a few projects in the making, but she also conducted herself in a way that would not suggest that she was planning to end things. She had just gone on a shopping spree with her mom for her new job at the club. She had made appointments. In the emails, we can read that she had once again upcoming projects and she hoped the following year would be better. And on the flip side, Phil had a known pattern of threatening people with guns and pointing them towards people, and a handful of ladies came to testify that they had been in the same situation where when they got to his home and he was drunk, he would pull out a gun and demand to sometimes put it in their mouths. He would hit them with it across the face, threaten to kill them if they didn't do as he said or if they attempted to leave. His son Louis also later said in an interview that from his room, which wasn't far apparently, he had heard many women plead Phil to take the gun out of their face. He'd heard them weep and he'd heard Phil yell, threaten, and force them to comply with his gun. So even he wasn't surprised that this would eventually happen. In fact, most people in Phil's entourage think that he was a ticking time bomb and something like this was bound to happen eventually. Of course, he denied everything, down to the women's testimonies, and filmed himself holding a $100,000 check for the one who would pass a polygraph test because he said they flat out lied and that, quote-unquote, testifying in court is bullshit, apparently. Anyways, Spector wasted no time in contacting Robert Shapiro, a lawyer famous for having been part of the team that defended O.J. Simpson. Shapiro managed to get him to remain free while awaiting his trial on a $1 million bail. However, he was quickly fired because he suggested a plea deal or something like that. In fact, he was even sued by Phil for refusing to return a $1 million retainer for legal services. Spector ultimately settled the lawsuit against Shapiro for an undisclosed amount and went on to change lawyers a bunch of times. On March 19, 2007, Spector's murder trial began. The proceedings were televised and it was a circus. Everybody wanted to attend, and to top it off, Phil wore a different wig every day, and all of them were interesting to say the least, ridiculous for some and downright disrespectful for others. The wigs ended up being the center of attention instead of the crime. So only 5 women were allowed to testify against Phil, but there were apparently a dozen who claimed the same thing happened to them on a date with him. On September 26, a mistrial was declared because of a hung jury, 10-2 for conviction. His retrial began on October 20th, 2008, and this time it was not televised, probably due to the wig situation. The case went to the jury on March 26, 2009, and 18 days later, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. On top of that, Spector was found guilty of using a firearm in the commission of a crime which added 4 years to the sentence. He was immediately taken into custody and sentenced to 19 years to life in the California state prison system. Various attempted appeals were unsuccessful in 2011, 2012, and 2016. He got COVID in December 2020 and died in an outside hospital on January 16, 2021 at the age of 81 due to complications from COVID. By the way, I forgot to mention, but in jail he was not allowed any wigs. So he asked for hats, but he was not allowed any hats. So he ended up asking for a kippa, and he was allowed to wear a kippa. But just for you to know, wigs and hats are considered contraband in jail. Back to the story. In the end, nobody really knows how things played out that night. Was it a freak accident? Did he follow his habitual pattern and trigger a sort of spontaneous response from her in a moment of weakness, amplified by fatigue, meds, alcohol, and maybe yet another feeling of letdown and disbelief towards the people of LA? Him in this case, which led him to maintain his accidental suicide stance throughout the whole time? Or did he really lose his shit and intentionally pull the trigger? He will take his secrets to his grave, I guess. But whether he did it or not, I think that he still deserved to go to jail for holding people at gunpoint so many times throughout the years, for threatening people around him, for keeping his wife sequestered, and for child abuse. Furthermore, had he not pulled out his gun again, Lana wouldn't have died, period. Whether it was a freak accident or an act of desperation facilitated by the circumstances, or a murder. I just found out a Showtime documentary just came out on him, and there's a biopic in the making with Al Pacino as Phil. So be on the lookout for that if it interests you. It might even already be out for all I know. Phil would probably have loved to know that Al Pacino was going to portray him. It would have flattered his ego. Anyways, I'm starting this new series of episodes that I'm going to call Pop and Crime, in which quite obviously I'm going to be focusing on crimes within pop culture. Be sure to subscribe for more of these if you liked it, and in that case, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and share it with your friends if you feel so inclined. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!